if you're a visitor from out of space or a new minister coming in fresh to a portfolio like agriculture, and you sat down and thought, where are the winners going to be? You would look at the horticulture sector and you would say, healthy, food, nutritious, all the health diets all say you should eat more fruit and vegetables, so that one's going to be ticked. If you look at its land footprint, it's not huge, and it's a very efficient and high value converter of water to food, so we'll tick that box. It doesn't produce a whole pile of greenhouse gases, doesn't result in degradation to the environment anywhere near like the broadacre sectors do, so we'll tick that box. Export market demand, we'll tick that box. Regional development, jobs in the bush, regional industry opportunities, we'll tick that box. So if you're a new minister coming in, like your new minister, you would say horticulture is where it's going to be. Horticulture is where the promise is. And yet, if you're an old minister going out, I suspect you'd say, bloody horticulture. Absolutely hopeless. That's the sort of scenario I think you'd look at. You may argue with that, but I think it's interesting to go through some of the numbers and go through some of the history. But of all the agriculture sectors in Australia, I would say horticulture's got the most potential. It ticks the most boxes, and it's consistently underperformed and failed to deliver for the last 30 years. So I think that's an interesting challenge you've got in front of you. So if we start right at the big picture, unless you live under a rock, you've heard the news that to feed 9 to 10 billion people by 2050, we're going to have to increase total food production globally by probably 70%, depending on which number you use. So that's certainly, in terms of global demand, in terms of the total outlook for agriculture, that's a very positive story, and that's certainly been pushing the numbers. And it's interesting in that even though we do tend to talk a little bit about the protein story, dairy, red meats, etc., there's almost as much growth projected. So the red lines are the 2050 demand and the blue lines are the 2007 numbers. So there's almost as much growth projected for the horticulture sector as there is in terms of red meat and the protein story. So even though it sometimes gets overlooked in this whole discussion, certainly the numbers there and the projections there suggest that horticulture's got as much to gain out of the growing population and the growing wealth of consumers as the other sectors of agriculture. And certainly if you look at China, for example, and look at the per capita consumption, so kilograms per capita per year of fruit and vegetables, starting at this end in 1960 and up to 2007. You see fruit perhaps not so much, but vegetables in particular, incredible growth in consumption of those products as the wealth effects started to flow through, as urbanisation started to occur in China. So certainly the numbers on those projections suggest, or on those actual statistics rather than projections, suggest that the projections are correct in assessing that there's a lot of potential there. And if you look at some other projections, these are some numbers that were released recently in some research that was done, and it basically is looking at, clumsy fingers this morning, basically looking at the projected availability of fruit and vegetables to 2025 and 2050 compared to the projected demand. So they've based the projected demand on population growth, etc. And so where the supply-need ratio is equal to 1, that suggests they're confident that the production will be able to keep up with demand. So obviously in the high-income countries, they're suggesting the demand will be able to be met by supply, and in some of the upper middle income countries perhaps out to 2050, but certainly overall suggesting there's a deficit there. So in other words, that demand will exceed supply, or is projected to exceed supply based on the numbers that are available at the moment. So certainly all that is positive for horticulture, and if you look at the general picture of food prices, including some of the horticultural products, we certainly know that the story was, up until about 2000, generally negative, even in nominal terms, let alone real terms. And since that time, positive, albeit there's been a cooling off in the last 6 to 12 months. But generally, that tells us that something's happened there, and that sort of demand/wealth effect is starting to affect prices in the marketplace in the global sense. And certainly if we look at our dairy industry, our beef industry, our lamb industry, and just look at the numbers going to China, there's certainly a real story there of that sort of growth that's been projected. But, and there's always a but, let's have a look at the reality. I think the first reality we need to recognise is, despite that demand, and despite the fact that a lot of our leaders and a lot of our commentators say, and not only that, but this demand is in our region, I think proximity is in fact an absolutely misleading concept. And we did some research a while ago looking at the differences in freight on a 40-foot container of refrigerated product from all the different exporting nations, and even countries like Brazil, where you have to go all the way around South America, up through the Panama Canal and across to Shanghai. The difference in terms of cents per kilo on the freight was only about 12 cents, and freight rates have actually come down since then, as the economic activity in the world has slowed down a bit. So this whole notion that proximity, that this growth is in our region and it's therefore ours for the taking, I think needs to be cast aside very quickly, because certainly the numbers suggest that's not the case. And even if we move to the high value stuff in air freight, the differences are nowhere near the sort of numbers that you would anticipate to give us a real advantage. So I think that's the first thing we need to cast aside straight away. The second thing I think probably doesn't get enough attention, and that is that if we look at the global numbers, that projection of 70% increase by 2050, if you do your maths, that is met with a productivity growth rate on average over that period of about 1.5% per annum. So if you start with an index of 100 here as the 2015 global agricultural output, and you want to get to 170% by 2050, the number that basically meets that requirement is about 1.5% productivity growth a year, or production growth a year, not necessarily productivity growth a year. And if you look at the performance of global agriculture over the last 40 or 50 years, in fact, the average productivity growth is around about 2.3% per annum. So in fact, globally, agriculture has been able to more than match that requirement over the last 40 to 50 years. Now I know some of you will say, yeah, but we haven't got any warm water, the availability of land is going to be more limited, etc., etc., etc. But even when you look at these numbers, for example, the expansion of irrigated land contribution to that growth hasn't been all that major, and in fact in some periods has been actually quite small. So most of the gain has actually been improvements in total factor productivity, producing more from the same or less inputs. So the whole notion that the world's going to run out of food and we're not going to be able to feed the 9 to 10 billion, particularly when they're wealthier and urbanised, I think we need to be a bit careful about that. Unless climate change really has an impact on the potential for productivity growth, unless technology doesn't keep performing the way it has performed over the last 40 to 50 years, some would say the 1.5% per annum average is a snack. It won't be a problem at all. So that, I think, should sober us up in terms of what future demand and demand conditions might look like. And particularly if we look at Australia's performance in terms of productivity over the last period since about 1997, where, depends on whose estimate you use, but agriculture in total has only been able to achieve about a 0.3% per annum growth rate here in total factor productivity in Australia, compared to, so that's Australia there, compared to Canada, the USA, Brazil and New Zealand. Now, New Zealand got a free kick because they knocked down a lot of their forests and put up a lot of dairy, and so they actually got extra land which was already in use. So in terms of total factor productivity, they got a kick in terms of the numbers there, and you can certainly see that there. But even so, and we, I guess we'd say, well, hang on, the millennium drought from 2003 to 2009-10 was a big factor of that, because about a third of our agricultural output is grain, and it certainly got knocked then. But it certainly does bring you back to earth that the demand is perhaps overstated, and we need to be careful about that, and our capacity to supply is perhaps under question as well. And so exactly whether this is going to be a big gain in terms of agriculture in Australia, and horticulture more specifically, I guess is an open question. And certainly if you look at our export performance, if we look at the big 5 markets in Asia, so China, India, Indonesia, Japan and Korea, and look at where their agricultural imports have been coming from and what the growth rates have been over the last 10 to 15 years, the USA and Brazil have certainly been taking the lion's share of that growth. Australia hasn't done too badly. New Zealand's done reasonably well in percentage terms, but basically the lion's share of that extra demand has been met by by Brazil and the USA, and of course a lot of that extra demand has been for things like feed grains, which we're not all that strong in terms of exporting, whereas the soybeans out of the US, out of Brazil, and corn out of the US has certainly met that demand. And in fact, if we look at Australia's performance right across the board in each of the major regions we export to, where the red bars are the average annual growth in import demand in those regions, and the green bars are Australia's growth in export value to those regions, there's really only North Asia where Australia's been able to hold its own, and a lot of that's the beef story, particularly to Japan and Korea, because of course the US and Canada were knocked out of both those markets as a result of the mad cow scare in 2004. So we've pretty much had those markets on our own, and they're our major exporters there. But most of the other markets, Australia has lost significant market share in terms of our export markets in each of those countries. In other words, the growth has been occurring in demand, but we haven't been able to meet supply. And certainly if we look at our horticulture sector, whilst there has been growth, and certainly growth, so fruit and nuts are the blue bars, red on top is vegetables. Whilst we have had some growth, a lot of that has been things like almonds in the last couple of years in terms of fruit and nuts. And we certainly haven't had much growth overall in, for example, the vegetable sector. And even in wine grape production, we've probably plateaued since about 2001-2 in terms of total production, or in fact decreased in total. So whilst those markets have been expanding, we certainly haven't kicked goals in terms of total agricultural output here, and particularly in terms of horticultural output. And if we go further and look at our export performance, again, we've done all right in the last 12 months or so, but you would argue that since about the turn of the century, things have been pretty static in terms of horticultural exports out of Australia. So our export performance in this area hasn't been that good. And in fact, if we look at the net figure, offset that against our imports, and these are imports of fresh product, not processed product. In fact, imports have grown substantially faster than our exports have, and we're probably almost at the point of being net importers in some respects of fresh product. And that's further reinforced if we go around and look at market share of any of the major exporters out of the horticulture sector, any of the major exports out of the horticulture sector. Take, for example, wine. Wine, we did very well. We were growing market share in global terms, and then we got to about 2003-4, and back we went. Even though the total export markets were growing, I think the summary of that is wine decided on a bulk, low-cost export strategy just at the same time as most of the New World exporters really got going with exactly the same product, but at a fair bit cheaper than we were able to do it. So that's been certainly a pretty sad story when it comes to export performance for the wine sector. If we look at a whole range of other products, oranges, for example, while generally the picture has been of growth in terms of exports for most of exporting nations, again, in terms of market share, Australia's share of that global market has, in fact, decreased over that period. If we look at carrots and turnips, for example, same sort of picture emerges. If we look at apples, for example, the same sort of picture emerges. Obviously a much bigger volume traded globally, and therefore our share of that's much less. But certainly in terms of other nations able to grow their export products, and Australia not able to grow in terms of our export performance. So, and if we try and sum all that up with trends in fruit and vegetable trade, of course the figure starts to look reasonably negative. I think last year, of the 11 billion food imports into Australia, a substantial proportion of that was in fact processed and some of it fresh fruit and vegetables and horticulture products. So certainly not a pretty picture. So that minister that I was talking about at the start of the story might be starting to have second thoughts by the time you have a look at the actual performance as opposed to the potential. And if we look at, say, for example, in global terms, the value of fruit and vegetable exports and compare Australia. Australia's that green line there. It's probably a bit hard to see. New Zealand, we're probably about equivalent. We've just gone ahead of New Zealand slightly. In terms of Israel, a country probably about the size of northeastern Victoria, nearly matching us. Canada being able to grow there substantially, and yes, I know that there's a fair bit of Caribbean labour in Canada that performs pretty cheaply, and that gives them an advantage. And they're next to the US, which is a major market. So yes, they have advantages. But even a country like the Netherlands, very land constrained, has been able to perform along that basis. Now there is another part to the Netherlands story, of course, because if you look at the import value, it's grown as much as well. So the Netherlands has become a packing, logistics, freight, repacking headquarters in terms of a lot of the product that comes into Europe. But even so, it's still been able to grow the value add, particularly in terms of things like glasshouse production. And it certainly shows, and again, it's got proximity to Europe, proximity to those 700 or 800 pretty wealthy consumers, all pretty keen on fruit. But certainly it does show that Australia's performance, with the advantages we've got in terms of land, in terms of space, in terms of a whole range of other things, hasn't been all that flash when it comes to horticulture. So what are some of the challenges that seem to be getting in the road? I think the first one, and the one that always strikes me most strongly, is this whole issue of scale. When we look at the various agriculture sectors and segment the farm sizes, segment the population in relation to farm sizes, the thing that always stands out is that both horticulture and broadacre livestock have this enormous preponderance of very small scale operations. So less than 100,000 worth of total output. In horticulture, 50% of total producers fall into that category. In livestock, it's more than that. It's up to 70%, and a lot of that's the beef industry, and a lot of that's hectares around major regional centres, etc. But certainly in terms of horticulture, there's an enormous number of very small scale operators, and that's certainly always been a challenge when it comes to things like exports, things like consistent supply, all those sorts of things. And even you look at it and you would think, well, okay, if that small scale farm business structure is a problem, surely over time the forces that come to bear would force the growth of that, and you would see consolidation and scale. But in fact, you almost see the opposite. So this is the breakup of the demographics of vegetable growing farms in Australia, less than 5 to 20, 20 to 70, and more than 70 hectares. And what you're actually seeing is a reduction in the number of larger scale farm businesses rather than a consolidation into the number of... Now some of that might be to do with irrigation and concentration, more intensive production, but certainly the overall picture is one where you would expect to see consolidation into larger units and more efficient production units. You're not in fact seeing that. So that's certainly a real challenge, particularly in horticulture. I guess in some ways related to that is the not just the farm structure, but I suspect the industry structure, if you want to describe it as that, is one that's always been chronically disjointed. So if you look at the horticulture sector, I think there's 43 separate bodies at the national level represent the various components of horticulture, and that doesn't count for state and regional level organisations, of which there's probably at least that many again, if not more. So the industry, in a sense, in setting its direction, in setting its policy and in presenting itself to government, has always been chronically disaggregated into quite small units. And in fact, a significant number of those organisations probably wouldn't survive were they to depend entirely on membership numbers and membership revenue. In fact, a lot of their operational revenue in a lot of instances are basically levy funds from organisations like Horticulture Innovation Australia Limited. So this the chronic size problem, if you like, at the farm level is almost again reflected in the issues at the industry level, where to try and get a clear line, a clear direction, a clear response from industry has typically involved a very convoluted and very disjointed approach from that industry. So that, I think, flows through in a whole range of different areas into some of the problems the industry faces. I think the other problem, and I guess related to that, is the way the R&D arrangements are in Australia. We certainly cover a lot of geography, and that sometimes works to our disadvantage, but I think increasingly we're seeing the major universities in particular becoming almost isolated from industry. And I use the example of the Knowledge Centre for Agriculture in Denmark, which has 400 extension staff, the University of Aachen and about that number of researchers again, and then a whole pile of industry organisations, all located on the same campus or within close proximity to each other. And sure, they've got the advantage of geography there. Denmark's only 2/3 the size of Tasmania. But we see the same sort of structure in the Netherlands with Wageningen. Again, industry, university researchers, industry processors and exporters all operating in a cluster and all interacting with each other. And that seems to be certainly one of the secrets to growth. I think what we're trying to deal with here in Australia is certainly amongst the group of 8 universities, universities that are driven by overseas student numbers, which in turn requires them to publish their research internationally to get up the rankings to attract more students. And the last thing that you want if you're doing that is to have to go out and interact with industry. So I think we've developed an R&D model here, or a research model here, that industry is actually a problem to rather than a partner in. And I think that's not unique to horticulture. And in fact, a centre like this is probably unique in some respects in having industry with close researchers interaction and government interaction. But I think as a bigger problem, that whole structure of how the R&D is done in Australia and how the universities work in Australia is a real problem that affects the industry. On top of that, we've had declining state government revenues, and I know each of the various state departments I talk hopefully about their future and the investment and the role that governments will play in continuing to support agriculture, but the performance over the long term tends to be one where we tend to keep seeing cuts to the Department of Agriculture. And I know Victoria had it a couple of years ago, and Western Australia's copying it this year, but it always seems to go one way. So I think that's a particular challenge for the industry as well, given the structure of the universities and then given the structure of the state departments, where resources are certainly becoming more limited. Of course, the other issue that's always been a challenge over recent times in Australia is the 1,000-pound gorilla sitting in the corner, and it's particularly a challenge for perishable products like horticulture, where you're going to have a volume of product coming onto the market quite quickly. It doesn't last very long. You need an outlet. There's the outlet, but of course the outlet doesn't necessarily do you any favours when it comes to pricing or profitability. And so we look at our major food processors, for example, Burgeye, Edgell's, McCain's, SPC, and all of them have had chronic problems in generating a profit and being able to grow over the last decade or two. And I think the 1,000-pound gorilla in the corner has a fair bit to do with that. And of course, if they are the platform to export success, which of course they are in overseas locations, and they're absolutely scratched for profit here in Australia, then the potential for them to develop a platform and develop that export potential is certainly severely limited. So that, I guess there's some of the challenges. Do we actually have any opportunities? Well, I think we do, because we tend to forget this, but I keep coming back to it, and I know it's overly simplistic, but certainly as consumers, not only in Australia but around the world, get wealthier, their needs and their requirements move up good old Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And that, in fact, in some respects, even though we might think things like animal welfare standards, pesticide regulations, all those sorts of things are impediments to production, in some respects they sit Australian industries well to be performing at that higher level in terms of consumer demand and wants and needs, where the consumers are prepared to pay more for those particular products. So in very broad picture terms, our capacity and our ability to meet those sorts of higher order requirements is in fact better than a lot of the competitors in the marketplace. And you know, we only have to go to the Nana's Berries example as a classic case. Even though the origin of the food safety problem hasn't really been sorted, the reality is that consumers are wary of imported products. I heard the managing director of Paddy's Foods say yesterday that about $50 million had been knocked off the annual revenue generated by frozen berries as a consequence of that scare. And we've heard all the announcements about retailers and others seeking domestic suppliers for those products. So there's a classic case study, if you like, of wealthier consumers having those sorts of concerns and being prepared to pay for it, and that having some consequence in terms of the performance of Australian product in the marketplace. I think the second, and related to that, I think whilst we continually struggle in terms of deciding whether there's enough resources allocated to biosecurity, by and large, Australia has a pretty good story to tell. And it was interesting to hear Luke mention that biosecurity, and particularly in relation to how it affects market access, is going to be an increased focus. And I think there's quite an important issue there, because that market access very much depends on the biosecurity status. For all our concerns about our performance, we actually do biosecurity reasonably well in Australia, and that's quite an important part of the platform around what is the product that comes out of Australia, what are its inherent characteristics, and where should it be positioned in the market. So I think that is quite a good opportunity. I think related to that is the sort of example we see out of a horticulture sector like that of the Netherlands. So if you look at the Netherlands, you know, $20,000, $30,000 a hectare, a couple of $1 million to put up a glass house, very limited space, everything works against it. And yet it's been able to develop an enormously successful horticulture sector out of a combination of things. I think they promote themselves very well. So Dutch horticulture has quite a strong profile. They are very strong on science, and some of the major operators in there are spending up to 10% of their annual turnover on R&D. So they're very driven by the advantages that technology can bring, and of course they've got proximity and a whole chain profile that works to their advantage. But nevertheless, I think this combination of being very good at promoting the characteristics and the values inherent in Dutch horticulture, combined with the reliance on technology and working right through the whole chain and having that sort of integration between the research and the industry is working very well. If you were sort of say there's a glaring weakness in horticulture in Australia, it's around here, because what tends to happen is we have something like the Paddy's berries case, where everyone suddenly decides Chinese berries are bad and we don't want those, and the automatic assumption is that everyone will change to Australian product, but no one is telling consumers why Australian product is any better. We haven't got that strategy around promoting the inherent values of the Australian product. Sure, we have occasionally we'll see promotion for apples or for bananas or for summer fruits or a whole range of different products, but in all those there's a common theme around things like biosecurity, around things like environmental sustainability, around things like pesticides and all those sorts of things that we do pretty well here, but we actually don't have a strategy in place to actually talk about that to Australian consumers, let alone international consumers. So lessons that are available from places like New Zealand, from places like Holland, even from places like Canada, where those inherent national characteristics are put together as a story and promoted to consumers as part of the reason. I mean, I think our strategy at this stage is put a green kangaroo on it, and that'll automatically mean everyone eats it, but I'm not sure that's sustainable in the longer term. And I guess the other issue is, and again we look to New Zealand and the example of Zespri, for example, there, which is essentially a cooperative developed out of a whole range of problems in the kiwi fruit industry over there, has grown enormously, has developed a whole of chain approach involving R&D and promotion and export marketing, and doing enormously well. And that's sort of some of the advantages that can be gained out of industries working together collaboratively and working in structures like cooperatives, which we can look at Batlow, we can perhaps look at one or two others, but we've tended not to do those very well in Australia. So perhaps bananas have done it better than others, but it's pretty hard to see examples where that sort of structure's developed, really promoted the product, really grown export markets, and taken a whole of industry approach to promoting the product. So there's some good examples there. And whilst labour and labour costs are certainly a challenge in Australia, when you talk of $23, $24 an hour for labour here compared to probably $7.50 in the orchards of California, probably to $2 or $1 in Brazil or perhaps in China itself. On the other hand, that's led to a lot more technological approach to what we do here, and I think that perhaps stands to some advantage in the longer term. So getting robotics, getting data, and getting those sort of things up and running and working to lift productivity are going to stand us in good stead in the long run. So even though that labour cost is a disadvantage, the fact that we're moving to alternatives to labour is probably going to stand us well in the long term. The other interesting development, and again it comes out of the Paddy's food thing, is this whole notion of local foods and being a bit more interested in where food comes from. And so there's a lot of stories, particularly for the domestic market, around that could be used to great advantage, particularly in relation to relationships with supermarkets, because I think the supermarkets have probably been through an era where they were riding roughshod over the suppliers and had a fair bit of control. And I think there's now almost a consumer backlash. And in fact, I saw some figures the other day where there's certainly a trend back to independent greengrocers and independent sources of fresh produce rather than buying through the supermarkets. So that trend linked to local promotions and local branding is certainly something that can be used to advantage in the sector and avoid the squeeze of the 1,000-pound gorilla, hopefully. So what are some conclusions? The horticulture sector is fragmented, lacking strategic direction and export focus. It has the most potential, I think, in a lot of respects of agriculture sectors in Australia, but doesn't seem to be able to get it all together in a way that makes sense. The larger operators are emerging, but farm scale still remains a major limitation. And of course, with that fragmented and small-scale farm operation, the issues of productivity are also a challenge. The supply chains are continuing to develop, but they're predominantly probably more for the larger enterprises, and a lot of them have a domestic focus. So we certainly see groups like Rugby Farms supplying lettuce to the major retailers, but again, they don't really have an export focus, and there's a small number of them tending to develop those supply chains. And the other, I suppose, sitting at the back of all this and relevant to this group here, is that we have started down the road to what you might call a more privatised innovation system. And we've certainly seen that more in the grains industry or in the cotton industry in Australia, where the scale of operations is such that they can afford, industry can afford to largely fund and operate its own research and development, but also its own extension services. That certainly happened to some degree in the grains industry. The transition from the district agronomist, if you like, to the paid agronomist has happened over the last 20 years or so. I think there's now roughly 50 FTEs of district agronomists left in Australia in the public service, and about 2,500 operating in the private sector. That's certainly happened in horticulture, but I think one of the challenges will be the industry structure and the fact that there's that still large population of small-scale farms, and therefore the innovation system and the way to get those innovations through to that scale of operation is going to be a bit more of a challenge, because of course they're less likely to be paying for those sorts of services. So that, I think, remains a challenge for horticulture as well. So it's probably not all good news. I certainly think the potential's there, but there's obviously some real challenges, and I guess the department is very well placed in Victoria in particular to address some of those challenges, but it won't be easy. However, hopefully that's some food for thought.